Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth meeting of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing in 2017. Apologies have been received from Stuart Stevenson and Margaret Mitchell, and can I welcome Mary Evans to the meeting today. Agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private. Are the committee content to take items 3 and 4 in private? This is consideration of the evidence heard at today's meeting and a discussion on our forward work programme. Are we agreed?
Content, yes.
Thank you very much for that. Agenda item 2 is the Independence Assurance Review of Police Scotland Call Handling Update Report, and it's an evidence session on Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary's review. Can I welcome Derek Penman, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary in Scotland, Christina Yule, the Lead Inspector, and Laura Payton, who is a Lead Inspector. We don't have a huge amount of time. We're a bit constrained on a Thursday lunchtime, so I intend to move straight to questions. Can I refer members to paper 1, which is a note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper. And perhaps could I start by asking you, Mr Penman, if you could expand a bit on the work that's been undertaken to progress the C3IR project to completion, and whether you'll be satisfied that once it's completed that it will be the optimum model for call handling?
Yes, if I can. Clearly we put our report out 18 months ago, which was a highly critical report in terms of call handling for Police Scotland, and we made 30 recommendations that we thought would drive improvement and also provide the stability required for the next stages of transformation and the moving calls from other centres into the new virtual service centre. We've been working alongside Police Scotland extensively since that time. We've done, I think, around 60 visits, some of which were unannounced, to work alongside them, and we've also been working very closely with their project team. So I think what we have is quite a high degree of confidence that Police Scotland have picked up on our recommendations, and that their project and programme planning have driven significant improvements as well. And on that basis, I think we are quite confident now that as they progress to the final stages of their project, that should be delivered safely. What we've also are aware of, and as one of our recommendations, was for Police Scotland to have a gateway review. So this is, again, over and above our own assurance, was to have some other independent assurance to come in and just check to see if the project was ready for delivery. And although that report hasn't been published yet, I can tell you that it was a positive report, and it was given a green status, which basically meant that they have confidence that the programme would be delivered.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if you could give me a bit more detail around something that's in the updated report. Under Leadership in Government, there is a paragraph which says, there is now clarity between the management of C3IR change programme and the management of business as usual within the division. Could you explain to me in a bit of detail exactly what that means?
What we had at the time was a project that was being delivered by a project team, and at the same time a management within Police Scotland who were delivering the here and now of that. And we were concerned at the time when we did our report that actually the here and now was about the change, and there was a disconnect between the two parts of Police Scotland. So what we were quite keen to do was to make sure really that the business as usual side and the project side were working much more closely around that, so the project team were able to identify and make the change happen, and the business as usual side were able to start to take that and make it work. So what we've found as we've gone through the review is the whole project management of the change is far better governed than it was before, and basically the commander who runs the business as usual side of things is also heavily involved in delivering the programme as well. So what you have is a much better integration of the changes being delivered by the people who are responsible for the day-to-day business.
So you're content things are progressing smoothly now?
Yeah, absolutely. And the divisional commander of C3 is now heavily involved in the change programme as well. So the two parts have been brought together. Well, what we effectively had was a disconnect where you had a project team trying to deliver a project and the management running business as usual. And our point was actually as the change is progressing, it gets fed into the business as usual part of it, and they have to be much closer integrated. And we certainly have seen that through our visits and our work with Police Scotland.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you now a bit about failure demand? Could you perhaps give us a bit of detail on the work that's been undertaken by Police Scotland to reduce failure demand, and what part that's played in the overall reduction of both 999 and 101 calls?
Yeah, what you're seeing in the figures is that actually the call volumes have dropped from the time we first did the review to where we are just now. One of our recommendations was for Police Scotland to better understand their demand. And for us, failure demand, it's a technical term used in call handling, but it's basically where people would phone in to report a call that wasn't then progressed, would then phone back in again, if you like, so you had frequent callers and things coming through. We asked Police Scotland to do a number of things. One of the things was the simple identify who were those people who were phoning in repeatedly, and quite a lot of that actually were people like Crown Office and other agencies who were using the 101 system to phone in. So they were identified, and that was streamlined, and that's taken some demand away from that as well. Police Scotland also identified some of the more frequent callers and have been able to manage that better too. The bit we feel Police Scotland still need to do more on, though, is to actually try and look at their demand from when the call is taken to the point when actually the call has been resolved and the police officers have attended it locally. So there's real efficiency now, I think, within the service centre and area control rooms to take the calls, to record them and to pass them out to operational officers. The bit we think still needs to be looked at is effectively how quickly are these officers being able to attend these calls and what resources are available to them to do that. Because what happens is the call can be dealt with really efficiently, answered within the target time, passed out to the local police officers. But if the local police officers don't attend that call within the timescale expected, the person will then phone back in again. So the failure demand, I think, for us still needs to be more evidence around is that local policing part of it.
Just before I move on and bring in other members, can I perhaps ask you about partnership working? Because when we've had Police Scotland in here before, an issue has been the way police on the streets deal with adults with vulnerabilities or difficulties. And I just wonder, in the issue of call handling, what degree of partnership working is there with the call handlers and other, whether it's the health NHS or other support workers, to make sure they get the right support when they're handling calls and they have enough information to be able to deal with the calls effectively?
No, I think that's a really good point. One of the things for us within our call handling report was really to make sure that Police Scotland had the ability to deal with vulnerable callers and actually prioritise their calls around vulnerability. Police Scotland have done a lot of work in terms of their call handlers now to allow them to be able to make more informed assessments of people's vulnerability. So that side of it is working quite well. I know that has involved a degree of partnership and other agencies working alongside them. Although not in place yet, I know that Police Scotland are actively looking at, how can they bring additional support into their service centre to deal with people who might be vulnerable or have mental health problems around that. And I know there's discussions taking place. Where they are at the moment, I'm not sure, but I know that Police Scotland are certainly very interested in how can they get support within their service centre, or perhaps other agencies who can deal with it, they could pass it on to. That's within the service centre. I know Police Scotland have been working very hard at the front line with operational officers in terms of trying to get other agencies and other partners to support them. And there's been some work done around triaging of mental health calls in some of the cities as well. So I know that's very much on Police Scotland's agenda.
Okay, thank you. Rona.
Yes, good afternoon. Can I ask you, Mr Pearman, if you're satisfied that C3 will have the necessary resources and staff going forward to ensure that it's, that it's a first-class handling centre?
Again, it's a very good question. And one of the key issues we found in 2015 was around making sure that Police Scotland had adequate staffing levels, and that's one of our criteria around what would be a stable system moving forward. Again, Police Scotland have embraced this. They have brought in an independent consultancy who've got experience in call handling and police call handling elsewhere in the UK, and they've actually developed a model or a tool that can work on the basis of the number of calls that come into the service centre, how long they take to answer, and basically model that into something that tells them how many staff they need at a specific point in time. So they've actually had that tool in, it's been tested, and they have on that basis worked out what staffing levels they actually need to have at those critical points. They've actually developed that into some reporting that has been shared with the Scottish Police Authority. So the Scottish Police Authority have also had a look at this and have been clear what Police Scotland's assumptions were and effectively approved those staffing levels. We have also looked at them and we're content with the planning assumptions that they have as well. And since our report was published, Police Scotland have made a number of significant changes. For example, in January they moved the call handling from Dundee into the Central Belt. And the model was used to get the staffing levels right at that time. And what we're seeing in the virtual service centre just now is call performance of, you know, around 97–98%, which would tend to indicate that when people are phoning, the calls have been answered within time, which tends to be a good indication that there are sufficient staff on at that time. So there's a kind of long answer to your question, which is I think Police Scotland they've got a science and a tool that they can now use, and actually that will help them get the optimum staffing levels at that time. We also know that as they're moving towards the change programme, they are keeping their staff levels quite high to give them that support that they need, just to make sure that when the calls have been transferred down and there's a new change, that they can actually cope with that demand as well.
I take it by your answer, you have the resources to cover all that?
Yeah, but Police Scotland do, and they're putting the resources in place. And one of our checks on the assurance is to make sure that if Police Scotland say they'll have 400 staff in place at call handling at that critical point, that they can evidence to us that they have. And that was certainly the work we did for Dundee, where we actually checked to see the staffing levels that they had in place at the time of that critical change.
Thank you. Can I also just ask you, Mr Penman, if you could expand on what you mean by greater innovation within C3 and how this could improve the current service?
I see where it's in the context of where I said them. There's a general part, I think, for me, for encouraging Police Scotland generally to be innovative and find new ways of working that would help them manage their demand now to create capacity for the front line. For me, is there a specific reference in the report that you've picked just to get the context?
I don't know what page it's on, but it's in there, yes.
I mean, for me, the general encouragement for me would be for Police Scotland to be innovative around their approaches, and that for me would be things like, you know, bringing in mental health professionals into a service centre environment that could help deal with vulnerability. It would be about bringing in new technology that would allow people to communicate with the service centre through online means or social media that would take demand away from phone lines and things, and just generally encourage an environment among staff where people can come forward with ideas and actually look out to see what is best practice in call handling.
So it's kind of ongoing monitoring and being proactive about that.
I mean, again, I think Police Scotland will be releasing their 2026 strategy, I think on Monday, which we welcome. Yeah. And I understand one of the key features of their strategy will be innovation. And for me, that is just that general part about looking to be, you know, what is best practice? How can they roll that out? Importantly, listening to their staff, because often the staff in the front line can be the most innovative and they understand ways of doing things as well. I mean, the whole point for me around innovation, I think, is to make service centre call handling as good as it can be, but also for Police Scotland to try and manage some of their demand back, to try and create some capacity for frontline officers to deal with the new threats, and the service centre is going to be a key part of that.
Okay, thank you.
John.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good afternoon, panel. And Mr Penman, thanks for your various reports. And I think to a lot of people, they may wonder about the committee looking at the issue of call handling. But to put it in perspective from some of the background we've got, it's the case that it remains that the majority of people's contact with the police is by telephone. And the figures are quite staggering, really. 500,000 emergency calls and over 2.5 million. Now, clearly, with these numbers, some things are going to go wrong, and you know, very, very sadly, some of them may be important. But I sense that you're very upbeat about the way Police Scotland have approached the issues around call handling.
Yes, and again, that's in the backdrop, though, of having probably written one of the most critical reports that HMIC has ever done in terms of call handling. But rather than just write the report, we took a conscious decision to work alongside Police Scotland. We've got, today I have a team in working in call handling just to make sure we're getting the assurances that we need. And again, in fairness to Police Scotland, they have embraced the improvement plan and they've made a real commitment in their leadership and their staff to drive those improvements forward. And our update report was really to say, you know, in terms of the recommendations we've made, considerable improvement has been made in terms of call handling. But I think you make a very valid and very mature point around call handling and just inherent risks that exist within call handling from there. I mean, as I mentioned in my report, I think there's always going to be a level of inherent risk within the operation of police call handling. And that's not just in Scotland. For me, that's in any, you know, United Kingdom or worldwide. Because what you have is a system that is relying heavily upon human interaction. Now, that's a call taker who is picking up the call and is having to make real-time assessments, quite often in difficult, challenging circumstances, on the information that they have. And also a caller who themselves might be vulnerable or might be distressed or under the influence of alcohol and drugs. So when you put that mix into police call handling, and that's just the nature of it among the 3.5 million calls that were there back in 2015, you just can't wholly eliminate that risk. What our report sought to do, and what Police Scotland have sought to do, is to try and reduce the risk and try and mitigate it and actually minimise it as much as possible. And for me, that was about ensuring that the call handling is appropriately staffed, which is the point the committee have raised today. So you have to make sure that it's properly staffed to meet the demand that's there. You've got to make sure the staff are well trained and the staff are supervised and are also supported around that. You've got to make sure the ICT systems are stable and can assist the call takers. And again, the Police Scotland have done a lot of hard work around ICT. They've delivered a national command and control system now. They've strengthened their CRM, their contact relationship management software that basically records all the calls, and they've built a new network for call handling. So there's a lot of work being done there as well. There has to be robust processes in place within the environment as well. But one of the most important things for me is there has to be a learning culture within the organisation where the staff are prepared to highlight notable incidents or near misses, and actually there can be continuous improvement. As I say, these are the things to me that Police Scotland need to have in place and that we've been checking on to make sure that that risk can be mitigated. But as you say, things will go wrong from time to time, and I think that's just the reality of the volume of calls and the risk that are within the service centre. An important thing for me, again, is that Police Scotland can learn from that, and where something requires to be investigated, that it can go to be investigated. The PERC it can independently investigate these incidents, and also that any learning that comes from that can be identified.
Can I ask then, in relation to that risks being assessed and the mechanisms in place presumably are intended to ameliorate the risks that can be ameliorated, that's not a static thing though. Is there an ongoing risk assessment? You talk about the future and emerging challenges, and to what extent, for instance, would the future upgrades play a part in that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose they're different. I suppose there's risks against the different categories as you identify around that. So there's a potential risk that the ICT systems might not be stable at the point you bring in new ICT systems. And again, we were critical of Police Scotland in 2015 for systems not being properly tested and things being rolled out. Since that time, very robust assurance processes have been put in place where individuals are testing things, are actually signing off to say they've been tested and they're evidenced. In terms of the new command and control system, Police Scotland brought an outside force in from England to come and do some quality assurance beforehand. So the individual risk around things like ICT systems are being ameliorated by actually looking at what the risk is and then making sure that they're in place. When the new system was rolled out, Police Scotland brought in additional staff. They brought in additional ICT staff to be available, and they actually had people who they described as floor walkers who were basically walking within that environment, supporting the staff who were there. So that's probably a good example where there's a specific risk around ICT change, and then Police Scotland put a number of measures in at that time to make sure that it will be in place. And I know when Dundee moved, calls from Dundee moved into the Central Belt, there was a lot of support put in for staff in Dundee, and I know exactly the same thing will be happening when Aberdeen calls are transferred as well.
Okay, finally, if I may, Convener, can I ask you about the state of readiness as key milestones appear in the stabilisation programme? Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I mean, again, we've been doing a lot of work with Police Scotland around asking them what are all the things that they have to demonstrate are in place, and they have a detailed plan that they have shared with us. So things like staffing levels, ICT processes in place, key things that have to be there. They have got a plan that shows when they should be there, and we're working with them around that. And what we're doing is doing some independent testing of that to make sure not only is it signed off, but is it actually happening. We're also doing a piece of work just now. I have staff in who are listening to calls that are being transferred from the north into the virtual service centre, because I want to provide some independent assurance that these calls that are coming in are actually being dealt with well, and that they're being properly recorded, and there's no issues around things like, as we've heard before, geography and accents and places and things. So there's a high level of assurance being provided around some of that as well. And I'd also go back to the gateway review that I had mentioned earlier. So as well as us doing this, we also encouraged Police Scotland and the authority to commission a gateway review. People who are professional, who can come in and look at a change programme. I say they've come in, the report isn't yet been made public, but I can say that they gave it a green. And that's about, they assess the readiness for service to make transition. And their view is they've got confidence in successful delivery around time, cost and quality, and they consider that it's highly likely and that they have no major outstanding issues. So again, a high degree of confidence around the readiness for Police Scotland to move forward into that next stage of change. Having said all of that, we will still be involved right up until the last moment around assurance from that. And the Scottish Police Authority, who've also brought in really quite robust assurance processes. They've set up a subcommittee just to deal with call handling. They will also want to be assured, and Police Scotland will demonstrate their readiness to them prior to the final decision being taken. So compared with what was in place 2015, there's a lot of process and a lot of people signing off to say things are ready.
Thank you. That's very reassuring. Thank you very much.
Mary.
Yeah, it was really just touching on some of the points that you'd made. I mean, you talked about the transfer from Dundee, how there were the extra staff in place there, and how you were in checking how all of that was going. And it was really just to get then your thoughts. I mean, are you confident then that when the transfer from the Aberdeen calls takes place and Inverness in the summertime as well, that all that will run smoothly, and confident that it will be effective when it's up and running?
I mean, there's also a risk of making these assurances and being a hostage to fortune around that. I mean, I think for me, it's going back probably to point, it's about we can assure ourselves around the systems and processes and make sure, probably from the learning that we picked up from 2015 and the things that, you know, ideally would have been done, it's making sure they are being done now. So on that basis, I think, you know, we have a degree of confidence that the transfers will take place well. There's independent gateway assurance that I've mentioned a couple of times around that as well. And I've also been briefed. I spent 2 hours last week with the divisional commander who was going through in quite some detail about how he proposes to make that change, and, you know, the particular time of day they've taken, the particular hour of the evening when it's going to be done has all been worked out around the most optimum time to do all of that. But again, they have also, when Aberdeen closes, they're going to have Aberdeen fully staffed, and they'll have the Central Belt fully staffed, and they'll have an ability to be able to unwind it if things don't go to plan and there's any issues around technology. So there's a lot of safeguards that have been put in place around that. And again, I think Police Scotland are in a far better place now than they were, and the level of professionalism that's been done around project assurance and programme management is much, much higher than it was before.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Liam.
Just following on from that, I appreciate you don't want to offer up any hostages to fortune, but clearly in your update report, there were continued, I think, concerns raised, particularly around the uncertainty for staff, that their future roles weren't clear, that actually there was an unwillingness to sanction transfers within Police Scotland to other roles. From what you said about the Gateway Review and your own work subsequently, are you reassured that management are now on top of those issues, that actually the staff morale is in a much better place, that there's a greater degree of certainty around what's going to happen and safeguards that are in behind that?
Yeah, well, Tina, just to talk about how Police Scotland have worked hard on their staff engagement, but you know, again, first for me, probably an opportunity publicly just to pay tribute to the staff in the service centre. A lot of them have been working under great uncertainty over their futures for many months now, in fact years, around that, and they have, you know, committed to providing a really good service. Police Scotland have always been aware of the need, you know, to keep staff informed, but there's been difficulties, I suppose, around getting certainty about when the project will deliver. Because they've done the robust project management, they're now able to say to staff with some certainty when these dates will take place. And we're aware, I think, that they have consulted with staff, particularly in the north, which is probably, you know, the last to be affected, what that would mean for them. So I think there's probably staff at least are aware now there's a high probability that will all work out for them, and they'll be able to leave the organisation as planned. What we've been quite keen to make sure, though, is that if there are any delays, that those staff don't have any detriment in terms of any early redundancy or voluntary redundancy packages, and we know that that's been held in place as well. But I don't know if Tina would like to offer perhaps just a little bit of background around the engagement that Police Scotland have had with their staff.
Yes. In the update report, we emphasised that the leadership of C3, there's been quite a lot of change in it, but there's been definitely a renewed focus on engaging staff and more productive relationships with the staff associations. And there has been a very strong focus on engagement throughout the period, particularly the last 18 months. I think communication is a very subjective thing that I suspect if you ask staff whether there's enough of it, they'll probably never agree that it's 100% where they would like it to be. But the effort put in by both the project team and business as usual management in communicating and engaging with staff has been significant, particularly in light of the criticism we probably levelled at it in the original report. So that's grown significantly. I think the paragraphs that you're referencing, particularly where we talk about staff in Aberdeen, that probably were anxious when deadlines were extended. Now again, as Mr Penman said, I think the SRO quite rightly reviewed the timescales, but for staff in Aberdeen that was another perceived delay for them. I think now they probably feel more confident after we've seen various milestones delivering on time that that actually will take place. But for those staff, it has been difficult. It's been a very, very difficult 2.5 years to be told that they were going to be closed, the limitations of potential redeployment opportunities, the fact that there would be voluntary redundancy and early retirement on offer. For some staff, they want to stay with the organisation. And because we've had to, or Police Scotland has had to maintain staffing levels in the north to maintain that service until these transfers took place, some staff have wanted to move on and been unable to do so. All of these things do affect morale, but there are risks that we've continued to highlight to C3 management, and they have taken on board. I think Inverness is a different issue where staff there felt relatively secure that their jobs were going to remain, albeit in a different type of function. But latterly they felt very unsure of exactly what those jobs would look like, what the gradings would be, what the supervision and shift arrangements would be. And as we mentioned in the report, Police Scotland have tried as much as they can to accelerate the production of the business case for what's going to happen in Inverness and give those staff certainty. And we maintain a focus on those staff in the north and their welfare with Police Scotland to make sure that they're mitigating those risks as much as possible through communication and engagement.
And is the feed, that's very helpful. I mean, is the feedback that, notwithstanding the point you make about communications can perhaps always be better, is there a recognition amongst the staff that you're talking to that that improvement has taken place? And against the backdrop you've described, both in Aberdeen to a lesser extent in Inverness, has that impact on morale translated itself into effects in terms of performance, in terms of absences from work or whatever, or is it I suppose manifesting itself in terms of people making clear concerns to yourselves about how they feel?
I think there hasn't been an impact on performance because, as Mr Penman says, these staff are incredibly dedicated to the function that they perform, and I suspect it would really have to be extreme before that would be affected. Their absence levels have been very good and really quite stable. They do have a couple of longer term absences that always affect figures, but in terms of their absence figures, we've been impressed that they've managed to maintain it, and C3 themselves have actually, again, the divisional commander has a real focus on absence, both in terms of supporting staff as well as trying to manage the levels down, and they've put a real focus in the last year on absence management to support staff through that. So we've not noticed any negative effects. We've had very limited communication directly from staff with concerns. But we always maintain contact with the staff associations, particularly Unison, to ensure that we're on top of what their concerns are, what their members are feeding back to them. And although the situation is difficult, and we acknowledge that, they do acknowledge the efforts that the divisional commander and his team have made in terms of engaging these staff and trying to make it, again, even physical visibility up in these locations wasn't great before, much improved now, so that they're actually seeing the leadership. They'll sit down and talk to people about the issues that they're having. And just finally, in terms of the overlap, Mr Penman, you were talking about how the operation will continue to function in Aberdeen, and if there's any need to draw back into Aberdeen, that will be available. Is there a time frame for how long that's likely to last?
That's effectively just for the hours, in terms of almost the shift, to allow that change, to make sure it's bedded in, that there's nothing would come in, or anything operationally that might come in and challenge that was unexpected. So it is that if you like, was just to provide the resilience at the point of handover.
So it's not likely to last.
It's not. No, it was literally. I was just trying to demonstrate that at the point of having a significant change, that they have, Police Scotland have identified the risks and have mitigated them by having additional staff and the ability, at a number of stages to be able to move things around if they need to do that from there. If I could just maybe pick up on the point of morale as well. I mean, again, call handling is a really difficult environment for staff. It's probably the most scrutinised area of policing, I think, that there's been ever, you know, and certainly in terms of our time, because we were literally almost with them all the time. And I think the thing for me, it'd be helpful just to recognise the improvement that's been made in call handling by Police Scotland, because there is something for staff who are in there every day doing, I think, a very good job in very difficult circumstances. There is just something there about this kind of constant, you know, feeling that in some way police call handling is not working effectively, or the headlines that appear in papers around crisis-ridden call handling, or issues around particular service centres. And I think that definitely has an impact on morale for staff, who probably will see improvements and will feel that things are actually better than they were, and will also hopefully feel they're delivering a good service. So there's something for me, you know, again, realising that there's always going to be risk and things will always happen. That, you know, it's being able to accept that, but actually recognise that improvement has been made, and actually that, you know, there is no crisis in police call handling.
I mean, that's an interesting point, because I think actually a lot of the concerns that were flagged up were being flagged up by those operating within the system who had concerns that either they weren't getting the support, that the resources weren't in place to allow them to manage the risk, as John Finney was saying, the over 3 million calls that are handled. There is risk there, and that I think concerns were being flagged up by staff themselves, and have only really been addressed as a result of them, as it were, blowing the whistle. I mean, is there, in terms of looking forward, are there mechanisms now for early identification of those problems that perhaps would avoid a situation where, when things don't go according to plan,
Yep.
they don't need to be emblazoned all over the front page of papers, or picked up in this committee, for example, that there are internal processes for dealing with those far more effectively than has been the case in the past? Yeah,
absolutely. Probably 2 points. I mean, the first point you raised is absolutely valid. You know, back in August 2015, we were speaking to focus groups of staff who were queuing up at our door, who wanted to speak to us, who wanted to tell us, you know, their experiences. From that, we don't have that anymore. We have people who are actually, as we go around speaking to them, are actually telling us about the improvement that's been made, and actually, you know, how things are a lot better. And I think that in itself is a key indicator. But the point you make is absolutely valid. And one of our recommendations was around notable incidents, and it was about for basically Police Scotland developing a culture within their service centre, and indeed across all of Police Scotland, where staff who think that things might not have been done as well, or who've got any concerns around a process or a procedure or staffing levels, really anything that they think, because the staff in the front line will pick that up first, they have got a means to flag that up to supervisors for it to be recorded and dealt with. And a notable incident process, which again I think was subject to quite a lot of media coverage recently around 95 incidents, and Laura had done some work in us around that. It's a really important process, I think, to have, and Police Scotland should be, you know, applauded for taking it on board and for doing it. And what it does, it identifies things that were near misses, you know, and that in itself can cause some concern, for, rightly so, for the public and others. But I think it's still really important that they are recorded and they're picked up on, and actually that improvement can be driven. And I know for a fact that when anything is raised, the divisional commander personally takes ownership of that and actually sees it through to drive that improvement. So it's a key question. And also you just need the ability to create a culture in the organisation where staff feel supported, and supervisors can come down and speak to them direct. So I suppose there are a long answer to your question, which is I think staff are in a much better place now than they were, but the processes are in place for them to raise issues of concern. What I'd like to see is that being rolled out across Police Scotland as a culture, generally, in every area of policing.
Ben.
Thank you, Convener. Just before I ask my question, I just want to say I fully agree that we need to emphasise the positive work that is being done, as well as continually evaluating concerns. In continuation of some of the points that John Finney raised earlier, I wondered if you could elaborate exactly how the instability of ICT systems within C3 was having an impact on effective call handling. And furthermore, what steps have been taken to improve matters? I know you mentioned the CRM previously, but perhaps you can elaborate on others, and whether further upgrades to the ICT systems within C3 will be required going forward.
Yeah, no, I think it's an excellent question, and one of our concerns was around ICT stability. And again, I know I'm sounding very positive today, but you know it's evidence-based because we've done a lot of work. You know, and you know the director of ICT and his team have made call handling a priority, and have put a lot of time and resource into that. One of the problems back in 2015 was it was at a time when Police Scotland were coming together. You had 8 legacy police forces effectively coming to one. You had 8 legacy ICT systems that really didn't speak to each other to any great extent. And in some cases, some of that wasn't particularly well documented. So what you had was things that were working within their own environment but weren't particularly well documented or even understood, potentially. So when things went wrong in those environments, it took a long time to try and work out what the problem might have been. And there's an element of that within Police Scotland. We had concerns around the stability of the network to connect the main 3 centres, Dundee, Edinburgh and Glasgow. And since our time, early involvement rather, Police Scotland have invested in a dedicated network, so actually there's a lot of bandwidth and resilience to join these centres up, so there's a lot of improvements being done in relation to that. There were 8 legacy command and control systems, none of which spoke to each other at the start of Police Scotland. Since our report, Police Scotland have now successfully delivered a national command and control system. Still doesn't take in yet Aberdeen, but will shortly. Doesn't yet take in Inverness, but will shortly. But the vast majority of calls now are held in a single command and control system. And what that means is for the first time ever in Scotland, anywhere in Scotland, they can see which incidents are happening. And as a national force have got the ability to manage those resources anywhere and actually properly deal with it. And that's a real significant achievement and one you'd expect Police Scotland to have in a national service. So that has also been rolled out now, and as I say, it's a significant benefit to the national force. And the last one was the contact relationship management software, which again, a bit of a mouthful, but effectively what it does is when somebody phones in, the system can check their phone number and it goes back and brings back the call history. So the person who's taking the call can actually see what the previous calls were, and that's really helpful in terms of assessing risk or just dealing with the call. That was rolled out as a national system. It didn't work well. It was stalling often. It was causing staff to abandon it on some occasions and not use it. Police Scotland, again, have done a lot of work with the supplier of that system, and they now have a stable, refreshed CRM system that is working well, and we've spoken to staff and had that assurance from them. So probably 3 tangible examples for me about where Police Scotland have looked at their technology and brought that together. I think your final point in your question though was, does more need to be done around the technology and is there more investment needed? My own view would be that, Police Scotland's approach was to try and bring everything together into this new national service centre and the 3-centre model with the technologies that they had available to them at that time that were tested, and that's effectively what they have done. The plan was always to then look to see what does call handling look like in the future, what are the new ways it can be done, where's innovation that can take place to do all of that, and that was going to be done through an ICT-enabled change. Because of the issues that Police Scotland have had with I6 that the committee will be aware of, which was about a national crime recording system, that will make Police Scotland have to have some difficult decisions around where their investment go. So some of the ICT investment for the future of call handling has been shelved currently. What we would hope for, probably in the back of Police Scotland's 2026 future strategy that I said will be released on Monday, that should set what is policing going to look like going forward, that part of that will be to say, how can the service centre take new technologies to help be more effective and be more efficient and take some demand away. So I think there's still great opportunities for new technology to be rolled out in the service centre.
But an evaluation process needs to take place on that once 2026 is...
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, good would look like, to use a horrible expression, would be Police Scotland understanding what do they want from their service centre in the new policing of Scotland as the future goes on. And I suspect what that should be would be something that's got a really strong customer focus, that when people are phoning Police Scotland to get a really good customer experience and it's actually dealt with really well. Now, some of it might be about getting their call dealt with on the phone and not dispatching police officers, because that would mean you can actually start to create some demand for officers to do other things in their communities. That will require a bit more of investment. I think there's more can be done about allowing people to report incidents and crimes in different ways online. I mean, it's not new, it's done by all sorts of sectors, so there could be opportunities to do some of that. There could be things about having managed call appointments, where people can actually book appointments for police officers to go and see them at a time that suits them. It's been done to some extent in the country, but that would require an investment moving forward. So I think, to answer your question, once Police Scotland know where they are, I think the customer and contact part will be a big part of the strategy. They then have to work out what they need, invest in that, and as you say, evaluate the benefits from that thereafter.
One more question for me, Convener. In relation to recommendation 16, Just wondered if you could comment on how the system of numbered notebooks works in practice. Is there any need for the information which is written down in the course of taking a call to be retained? For example, should the information which is written into notebooks by operators be typed up and kept electronically, or is that happening at present?
This relates to the expression we used was scribble pads, I think was the accepted version. We were critical of Police Scotland back in 2015 because what you had was various practices where staff would jot down notes on pieces of paper or put them onto a Word document or something like that. Our professional view was that staff need to have the ability to have something to write on when the call comes in, because as I said earlier on, sometimes, oftentimes people will phone in who are distressed, who are vulnerable, and you don't get my name is, my address is, this is my call. You'll get people who could just be shouting out a registration number or shouting something out. So there is a need to our mind for staff to have the ability to be able just to write something down so it's captured at that time. But the guidance is very clear from Police Scotland that that is only to help them catch that at the time, and what needs to be done is for that call to be properly put onto the national systems and properly evidenced. So it is just a scribble pad, it's for taking notes at that time. What we were keen to do was to provide some discipline over that process, and effectively what we asked was for Police Scotland to issue these as notebooks, so there was one system to record the scribbles as opposed to having lots of different things, and a process in place where staff were encouraged at the end of their shift, at the end of the call, but at the end of their shift, to go through the scribble pad to make sure the things they have written down and scribbled actually have been dealt with, and then just to mark a line through that scribble pad so they know that was done. And then when the books are finished, they then get kept. And they're subject to audit, and we also have a regime in place which we have checked, where supervisors in Police Scotland will come and will check that the pages have been scored out and the things have been recorded. So for us it was just a safeguard to take place. Everything that's in there must be put onto the system, and now the CRM system's working properly, that's achievable would be our take, and it is purely just there as a backup for staff just to be able to write something down in extremis.
That's reassuring that those procedures and systems are in place and diligent record keeping is taking place. Thank you.
Can I just ask you, Mr Penman, you mentioned in the report that further work will need to be done to assess the impact of the new risk and vulnerability training package that's been rolled out. Do you have any update on a timetable to do that?
I mean, what we're actually doing just now is we have an officer who's an inspector, rather, not an officer, who's come up from England to do some work from us just now, and he's actually listening to some of these calls. And what he's picking up, because I met with him last week, is that he's now seeing evidence of the call takers going through a process of vulnerability assessment on what they've done just now. So we're actually starting to see the evidence of that coming through. Police Scotland have wholeheartedly taken the approach around trying to manage vulnerability. And again, I understand in the 2026 strategy, as I said, more of that will come publicly on Monday, is a commitment from Police Scotland to move to a model called Thrive, which we had made reference of. We think it will take place within the call centre, because that's the first time people call. But we also see Thrive being a model that will be rolled out right across the whole force now, where it will be, and frontline officers will use the same techniques. And what it effectively does, it helps officers and call takers identify who are the people who are most vulnerable, who the greatest threat lies, and it helps them to prioritise. So we're waiting to see what Police Scotland intend to do as part of their new strategy. We think it's going to be much bigger than what we'd envisaged within the service centre, and we really welcome that. So I think what we'll do is, once we see what the plans are and the detail behind that, we would look to get in behind to inspect and evaluate that later at the time. So I'm not sure of a timescale yet, because we haven't yet seen the detail behind the full plans. Okay.
And are you assured that once all the training is complete, that there will be a level of consistency across all the call handlers? I mean, I understand no two calls are the same. The way people approach the calls will never be the same, but are you assured that there will be a level of consistency across the service?
That's what Police Scotland have got to be able to deliver, and that's done through an investment in training and investment in the processes that are there. And again, that won't be there yet because they're still rolling that out. The checks and balances for me is we will encourage Police Scotland to bring in their own quality assurance mechanisms. So as well as us coming in and inspecting, we would expect supervisors to listen into calls in real time. So when calls are coming in among their staff, we would expect supervisors to listen to those calls and among their team that they manage, for them to be assured that there's a consistency in where there's development needs for people to be encouraged and trained. We're also keen that Police Scotland will do their own independent quality assurance, so not the manager, not even necessarily the environment, somebody elsewhere. And I think that's going to be set up in Aberdeen actually as an independent quality assurance unit, where they'll have the ability to listen to calls anywhere in the country and do the same thing to make sure there is consistency around that. So I think that's absolutely what has to be strived for. The training has to support it, but there has to be some checks that Police Scotland will do internally, and maybe looking for those feedback from that quality assurance process to be fed back to the Scottish Police Authority, so they have visibility that that quality standard is starting to be met, or if it's not, how is it going to be met?
Okay, that's very helpful. Do members have any other questions? Rona.
I may have missed this in your report, and forgive me if I have. Can you give us an idea of the average sort of waiting time for calls when people call in? Is there any statistics to prove?
I mean, the reality is, as I understand it, 999 calls have to be answered within 10 seconds, and the current figures for them, I think, are 97%. Sorry,
I think the current average is around 4 seconds.
The average time to answer, the average time to answer is 4 seconds from there, but 97% of the calls are also being answered within the 10 seconds that are required. So summarising, 97% of calls are answered within 10 seconds, but the average call handling time is 4 seconds for emergency. And in terms of the 101 calls and non-emergency calls, the target, I think, is at 40 seconds, and 98% of those have been answered within 40 seconds, and the average call time to answer is 5 seconds currently. So these are quite, in terms of probably other people's experience of other agencies and commercial practice, it probably does demonstrate, even including the non-emergency, that the call handling times are there. I mean, we're really encouraged by the greater service, but there needs to be more than greater service, and we're quite keen that Police Scotland develop a balanced performance framework that would also pick up things like repeat calls, so people aren't getting a service or phoning back, because, if somebody is not getting a service and they phone back 8 times, and if 8 times their call's been answered, it almost validates the figures that they've been answered quickly, so it's a good service, but actually it might not be, because they're having to phone 8 times to get the service they need.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Ben.
Just briefly, while emphasising the point that you made earlier about call handlers doing a fine job in the majority, there are 2 issues that constituents raised with me. One was the point you raised at the beginning about the time gap between the call and officers attending, and the other was around unfortunately, in the area I represent, there are certain trends of crime that are recurring, and some of my constituents get frustrated when they phone up either 101 or 999 and they state the type of crime it is, and they're asked to almost legitimise it and prove that when they're making that call. I wondered around recommendation 13, when you talk about training and awareness, whether in your experience there is a sense that call handlers are being informed about where particular trends of crime are happening in the country in order to help expedite the
It's not something we've picked up on as part of our assurances. We were keen that Police Scotland are able to provide real-time information to their staff, and they've put screens up within the service centre that can brief staff around that. Police Scotland also have briefings for their staff, particularly the control room staff, before they start, to talk about some of these things. But I think there's maybe a maturity in Police Scotland that as it starts to develop, because again, to use that expression, what would good look like? Good would look like the service centre being aware of particular crime trends in particular areas, and actually probably Police Scotland having a view about what types of calls will be attended in what areas, depending on what priority they've been given at that time. And I suppose that's a challenge for Police Scotland to be able to do that moving on. I think what is important though is that constituents and others can feed back to Police Scotland around their experience in call handling, and actually, create that kind of virtuous circle where Police Scotland can pick up on that and make that improvement.
Thanks for that. Maybe one for me to pick up with Police Scotland, but also I think the point you made earlier about call history could be of assistance in that.
Yeah, and I think again you made a valid point, because there are, the nature of Scotland is one size doesn't fit all. You know, some things that have an impact on some communities will have less of an impact on others. You know, particularly in terms of minor crime and things. So it's getting the service centre and having the ability to be able to deal with that, I think, was behind your question, so that actually they get the response that the local policing team and the local commanders with communities have agreed that that local area would get. There's a need for the service centre to understand that and be able to support that frontline policing.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Liam.
I mean, I very much welcome what you've said there. I suppose as you were speaking, it occurred to me that not only can individuals move houses, therefore the association between individuals and numbers needs to be handled very, very carefully, but actually trends can change over a period as well, and what you wouldn't want to see presumably is a system that's locked into a particular perspective on certain postcodes having issues of some variety. There's a change, and yet that kind of history is logged and very difficult therefore to shift. So I mean, you would need some reassurance that it's a kind of real-time updating of this information, so it remains as accurate and relevant as possible.
I think that's exactly right. You know, for me, it's probably a maturity thing. You know, Police Scotland have made, as I said, you know, they've made considerable improvements from where they were to where they are now, and they know where they're going, and there's a strong focus on you know, customer service and things moving forward. You know, the CRM call history is only a guide. And I think staff are aware. It's just something there to inform staff to help make a threat assessment. So if the caller history shows things like domestic abuse or whatever within there, the call handler's got, you know, a heads up. There could be, you know, even if the call at that time might not be about domestic abuse, there's a history in the household and things, and that can help, you know, inform the vulnerability, which is really important. You know, I think what I'm probably, you know, moving to the future, if you have local policing teams who are delivering, you know, a policing service with local priorities that have been agreed at a really local level, it would be good for the service centre to be aware of that when the calls come in, so they can support what is being delivered in the front line, I think was my point, but that's probably a little bit further away.
Okay. We literally have a couple of minutes left, Mr Penman. We've covered a huge amount of areas today. I'm not sure if there's anything we've not covered that you want to bring to our attention before I bring this session to a close.
No, I think in my usual fast-paced delivery, hopefully I've managed to get
yes.
most of the things that I've done. I apologise for that, and don't envy I always enjoy reading the official report, which makes more sense, I think, of what I actually said in the on the video. No, I think for me it's just that recognition, you know, where we are. HMIC, you know, we come along, we produce critical reports, but our intention is to add value. We set a path, I think, in terms of our improvements, and there's a similar with Stop and Search yesterday as well, where another critical report. And what we're seeing is that Police Scotland are taking our report seriously. They are working very hard to deliver that improvement, and I think for me it's important to be able to come back, as long as it's evidenced, which it is in this case, to be able to come back and report to yourselves that improvements have been made. In call handling, as I say, the thing for me, and again, the hostage of fortune is relevant, and as Mr Finney says, there will always be a degree of risk in call handling, and things will happen, and that will continue to happen. And again, it is about how that risk is mitigated, and I suppose for me it's about how others respond to that when that comes through as well. For me, when these things do happen, it's important that the PORC and other people can investigate things independently, and we can learn from that. So, but I think it's great for me to get a chance to come along and actually provide an update to yourselves. I know you have an interest in that, so thank you for the opportunity. No, thank you very much for coming along. It's been a very useful session, and I'm sure it's something that we will return to. We're now going to move into private session. The next subcommittee meeting will be on Thursday, the 16th of March, when we will take evidence from the Auditor General for Scotland on our 2015-16 audit of the Scottish Police Authority. And I now suspend briefly to allow the witnesses to leave the room.